So welcome to Give Church a Try Sunday. Thanks for those who invited someone, whether or not they came or not. And welcome to anyone that came as a result of that. We have the need for this because times have really changed, just in my own lifetime. I'm 59 years old. And if you are my age or older, then you certainly remember a time when church looked very different. If you're a bit younger than me, you may not really connect to such a time. Because when I was a child, it was assumed that basically everyone in our culture would go to church. There was actually a lot of peer pressure to go to church. I remember actually that my parents said that they wouldn't go to any, there was one business owner in town who didn't go to church, as far as we knew. And so we wouldn't go frequent that business. That was what it was like back in those days. And curiously, it wasn't that long ago, really. To make that kind of a transition over relatively a short period of time in history and culture is rather amazing. And that's why it is so difficult for a lot of people. That we have very divergent kinds of opinions as to what church is, what it should be, how people should be responding, and all that kind of stuff. From a cultural perspective, there are understandable and legitimate reasons for criticism, and the church needs to own that. One is that church is irrelevant, and so oftentimes when we brought that old style of understanding church that said, hey, we're here, we're opening the doors, and we've got Bible study, and we'll learn about God. Okay, you just come. And meanwhile, people out there in the world were hurting and weren't feeling in any way that what the inside the walls of the church were doing impacted their lives whatsoever. There is the critique of being hypocritical. Certainly there have been many stories, many realities of church people not getting along with each other, church people attacking other churches, differing kinds of ways in which there have been all sorts of conflict. There is also, in the variety of ways that power has been abused by leaders in church, from pedophilia to all sorts of other kinds of expressions. Those are real. The church needs to acknowledge them and seek a way forward. From a church perspective, however, and anyone that knows me at all knows that I'm a pretty harsh critic of those church days really beginning with, say, the last 3 decades of the 20th century, is that we were coming alongside of that culture that was really asking the question, well, what good is church? And really saying that, okay, God says that he loves us, so a loving God should let everyone go to heaven. I'm a good person, at least I like to think I'm a good person. God should let good people go to heaven. I should go to heaven. So virtually everybody goes to heaven, just those like serial killers or something don't go to heaven. And then the question was, well, then why go to worship? Why be a part of church? That really was the question. And so church responded oftentimes in the United States of saying, well, church does good things. So we will go out and take care of people. For those watching via video, we just watched another video that dealt with bringing relief to people who have experienced the hurricane. Do we as God's people reach out to those who are in need? Absolutely. But that doesn't make us Christian. We aren't God's people because we do good things. Rather, because we are God's people, we are led to do good things. It's a very, very different understanding, and it's one that's totally lost on our culture. And the bad thing is that Jesus doesn't agree with our cultural and sometimes even church perspective, and that's very dangerous when we're talking about matters no less than salvation. Because Jesus will come along and he will say, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. Time and time again, he will talk about how the way to heaven is a narrow path. And you go, uh-oh. But then he'll go, but I'm the path. So you just stick with me, and you'll be good. Well, that's the story of Jesus. But the story of Jesus is told really only in the context of faith community. Meaning, wherever two or more are gathered in God's name, that is church, whether you want to call it that or not. And so I like to think of it as faith community, that God hardwired us to be in relationship to each other and in relationship to him. That's really all he cares about, no more, no less, but that is absolutely integral to him because God is love. God wants to experience love. God wants to express love. God has to do that, and that's what he's looking for from those who would follow him. And it isn't about that somehow I do good so God likes me and God accepts me. That isn't it at all. It is that God gives me his heart. And then, that's just the natural thing for the heart of God to want to bless others. It's a very different kind of understanding. It's one that seemingly got lost on church, no less, so that's our fault. And so, given all those kinds of cultural critiques, yes, they're true, and they have to be dealt with, but there is ultimately, I think, even that larger issue from the church perspective, that we embraced a culture that said, it's all about being good. And now we hear that all the time from people, including church people, that I'm a good guy, I look forward to going to heaven. And it's not the words of Jesus in any way whatsoever. I was chatting with a church this week. It was actually, some of you know, I moonlight as a church consultant. And we were talking about the prospect of me working with them potentially. And lo and behold, church in another state and said, hey, you know, we used to be a larger church. Now, not only are we not growing, we're actually getting smaller, and we just don't know what's going on. And there, too, in that sense, that the pain is so significant that we don't understand that is almost the journey of every church today. You know, there are a few churches that are growing, a few churches that have gotten really big. And we just focus on those, when the reality is so many people are giving up on the Jesus journey through church, and the churches need to band together and not in any way judge one another, but rather say, hey, this is the reality. How do we proceed? And so whenever I talk to anyone in that kind of a sense, I usually point to Paul in the Bible. He wrote a lot of the New Testament. He was the one who basically single-handedly brought Christianity to the world. Otherwise, Christianity may well have pretty much been a Middle Eastern event. But he takes it to the world as it was 2,000 years ago. That includes going to Athens, which was a long way for him to go. He ends up in Athens, and Paul is the kind of guy that is really in your face. For the most part, particularly, if you said, I'm a person that follows Jesus, and he sees you messing up, he will tell you about it in no uncertain terms. But that's not the case if you were not yet claiming to be a follower of Jesus. Then he was pretty genteel. And that was the case with these people in Athens. Because you know that internally, he had to just be writhing. Because he gets to Athens and he sees all these Greek gods, all these idols from his perspective. He could have said, you're all just bad people. You're all going to hell because you're following these idols. What's the matter with you? You need to follow Jesus. Boom, go. No. He sticks around, chats with the community, gets to know them over a few days, meanders through all the statues and the altars. And he comes upon one that says, to an unknown God. And that for him is the way that he can meet people where they're at. And so he says, hey, Athenian people, we have a lot in common. We're both religious people. And, you know, you have that one altar that says to an unknown God. And you know what? Because you're religious like I am, I happen to know who that unknown God is. And let me tell you about him. His name is Jesus. And that was his road in. It was a gentle road. It was a way in that didn't judge them, didn't put up a wall or a barrier, but actually embrace them. And that is precisely what we need 2,000 years later, is to meet people where they're at and to recognize all of the critiques have some legitimacy. So what are the threats of our culture? What is it that plagues us in everyday life? There's a lot of fear going around, particularly kind of post 9/11. There's a lot of worry. I recently did a series on worry. I expected it to be adequately received, but it had more response than I anticipated. We have matters of sexuality that are out of sort and confusing for us. There is all that kind of pressure from a culture that says you need to succeed. What does it mean for me to succeed? And how does that come alongside if I say I'm wanting to follow Jesus? Those sometimes seem to be very different things. We have health matters. We're living longer, and sometimes that means we just have more health concerns. Well, okay. How do you deal with that? And there are times when we will say, and we hear other people say, that God will not give you more than you can handle. That doesn't show up in the Bible. That's not a helpful thing to say, because it's not really accurate. There are all sorts of other spiritual powers out there that are working against you. But what you can be confident of is that God is going to see you through it. That was last week's sermon. This week's is, and that God's going to make it better. Now, the caveat is it may not be in your lifetime. And we're going to see that here in a minute, of how that can be true. But if you're at a place where there is not even light at the end of the tunnel in whatever's going on in your life, then there is that assurance that there is light coming down from above. And that it's just a practical matter, and that's why I so yearn for people to be a part of faith community. Because I don't see there to be any level of hope out there, the likes of which that you can discover with Jesus. He is clearly the best hope. Oftentimes you might say he is the only hope, it seems, out of very dark days. And that's the reality. People, you hear their stories and it tears you up internally, and you want for them to at least to have that kind of sense of God seeing them through this, and that comfort that comes in understanding that if I just follow my heart that is connected to God, that God's going to see me through this, and God is somehow going to make it better. He promises that. There's even Romans 8:28. Whatever it is, God is going to make something good of this. That's a profound and even difficult thing to believe, that out of all the horrible things that sometimes can happen in our world, that God promises that he will find a way to do good out of that for his people. So that's the deal. Now, how do we know that? Because you should believe me because I'm a good person and whatever. Absolutely, yes. I appreciate the heads shaking. Yes, I love you. But not only that. Maybe you trust me. Good. But we have these biblical stories that are there for you whether you trust me or not. And that's the deal. Because your stories are just like their stories. There's differences in whatever. We wear shoes, they wear sandals. I don't know. That's it. And we think of, they're biblical people. They were just like astounding, like, no, these were real people. And even those, we talked last week about Noah being called blameless in the Bible. That wasn't in certainly any kind of way that he was a really good person oftentimes. Not true. And we're going to find that as well today with Abraham. And so here's the story. And here's where you can take confidence that if God did not give up on people who were flawed and all sorts of stupidity displayed in their life, then if you're honest, okay, you're flawed and you have all sorts of stupidity in your life too. It's just there. The Bible says we've all fallen short of the glory of God. No one is any better than anyone else. No one is any worse than anyone else. That's just the way it is from the spiritual, eternal looking at things. All right. So it isn't what you do. It isn't being a good person. It's having the heart of God. Here we go. So with a new church, with a new fall year, we basically follow the school year. 9 months to go through the Bible. So we began at the beginning, book of Genesis, and looked at how God wanted to proceed. God was looking for, because since God defines himself as love, he's always looking for ways to express that and to experience it also as well. So he says, I'll make humans. I call it the human experiment. And so he has, maybe you know the story of Adam and Eve, the whole fruit thing. We don't know it's an apple. Don't call it an apple, but whatever. If you want to call it an apple, fine. And so anyway, God says you can't eat of that because then you're going to know what I know. I don't want you to know that. Now, it's interesting. You can fight all day long if you want. Why did God allow that to be then in Eden? Why was that there? Okay, well, because it has to be, ultimately. Because people have to have the opportunity to choose not to love God. Otherwise, it isn't really love. God doesn't know if you're really loving him unless there's an option not to love. There's the deal. Well, Adam and Eve, they blow it right away. And they get at it with each other, and they're blaming anybody but themselves. Phase 1, failure. So, God says, now what I'm going to do? Wipe the slate. You know, that's what you do. Oftentimes we do that. When things don't go well the first time, just start over from scratch. All right, so he does. All right, phase 2. All right, wipe out virtually everybody. Noah, he's blameless. All right, we'll pick him, take his family. All right, do the whole flood thing. Start all over with new people. Okay. There was a lot of pressure on Noah. I'm going to give him a little bit of the benefit of the doubt. Try to give him a way out. He was in charge of trying to help people to quit being stupid, and a new day, a new group of people to follow God. Okay. So, I don't know. If the pressure got too much for him, but anyway, one night, he gets so drunk that he's laid out naked on the floor. And interestingly, from the biblical perspective, that's not a problem. That's okay. Noah is still blameless. What is the problem is, one of his sons, he has 3, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham shows up. He's the one that discovers naked dad, and he laughs. He thinks it's hilarious. And he shows disrespect for his father, wants to go tell his brothers so they can look as well, and laugh at dad. Now, so many times, apart, even 4,000 years later, we don't understand. And that even all churchy biblical stuff aside, you should understand these stories if you want to understand why there is this fighting between really kind of Middle Eastern thinking and Western thinking. Because in the Middle East, they don't look at time in as kind of chronological a manner as the West does. And even like if you go to a Jewish worship service in Israel, they will talk about the Exodus that was 3,300 years ago with Moses, and they talk about it as if it happened today. They use present tense sometimes. That's how the Middle East looks. So, something that could have happened 4,000 years ago is still contemporary for those folks. And if it was never resolved, then it's still alive. And that's a big reason, because here we go. Phase 3. God says, well, man, it seems that these humans just can't fix themselves. I've tried everything I could think of it. So we're going to have to take a new approach. I'm going to do an unconditional covenant with them. I'm going to give them land and a people, and I'm just going to do that for them. They don't have to do anything. They're going to be my people. It'll be great. Okay, here's how we do it. So, pick a guy. Any guy. It was like Wheel of Fortune. Abraham. Because there didn't be anything whatsoever to distinguish himself. He wasn't even referenced as blameless or something like that. He was worshiping all sorts of gods, as was the norm for that period in time. And the only thing good about Abraham is that God stops by and says, hey, I want to make a great nation out of your descendants, and I want to give you a whole bunch of land, and it's going to be a new paradise, a new Eden, land flowing with milk and honey. What do you say? All you got to do, and you got to do this, is move down there, because you live way in the north, and he's going to be going down south. And for some reason, he says, okay, sounds good to me. Now, the problem, however, is Abraham and his wife, Sarah, have no children. You can't have a great bunch of descendants if you don't have any children. And they're going to make all sorts of mistakes along the way here. And it isn't their mistakes, but it is their heart that God is concerned about. And the biggest deal is they're not going to trust God in this. So the Bible is so matter-of-fact earthly. It gets indelicate from time to time. So it is for Abraham and Sarah. In no uncertain terms, and as put as delicately as I can, Abraham and Sarah, neither one of them were able to do whatever was necessary to procreate children, okay? The Bible just says that. Poor Abraham, especially as a guy, I kind of feel for him. All right, so you understand. Here's the deal. And God says, I'm going to give you children. Sarah will ultimately laugh. Me, as an old lady, how in the world am I going to have children? That's just silly. God doesn't appreciate that. So, one day, and this again, you got to read the Bible. It is hilarious. It is entertaining. It is real. Okay. You got to recognize it. You got to put away all that kind of super religiosity stuff and just read it. It's a great story. Abraham and Sarah. So, recognize, particularly in that culture, the only way a woman had any sense of personal identity was in her ability to have children. And Sarah had none. And she was beyond the days of having children. So she comes, I say, in horrific pain to her husband and says, Abraham, you know I have no children. Yeah. We got to have children if we're going to do this whole descendant God covenant thing. Yep. I don't know what to do. Nope. God says, trust him. Yep. Maybe that means we need to do something else. Maybe in trusting him, we're supposed to do something else. Okay? I mean, I do have this slave woman, Hagar. I suppose you could have a child with her. Has anyone ever known a woman? The correct answer from Abraham is absolutely not. I wouldn't do that to you. Abraham, it seems, goes, oh, all right, if you say so. Stupid Abraham. Because it isn't going to end pretty. Somehow or another, Abraham is gifted in a way that he can procreate a child. And he has a child with Hagar. His name is Ishmael. I told you God wasn't happy and said, what's the matter with you? I told you I was going to give you a child. It's in my time, not yours. Your deal was to trust me, and you didn't. But God doesn't say, so phooey with you. God goes, boom, Sarah gets pregnant. And Sarah has a child. And they name him Isaac, which means laughter. They named their child Laughter because Sarah laughed at the prospect of having a child. Well, that's all well and good, except those two births have huge implications for us 4,000 years later, because Ishmael will go on to become the father of Islam, and Isaac will become the father of Judeo-Christianity. And so the question is, who is the legitimate error of Abraham. That's what we're fighting about 4,000 years later. From the West, we may not really care. And to the Middle East, we go, that was 4,000 years ago. And the Middle East says to the West, you've lost your spiritual vitality. And they may have a point. It's all about how you understand who is God's uniquely chosen, at least is the question. Now, again, when you're reading the Bible, and it's a great fun book, you should read it. Always look for what seems to stick out. That you go, why'd they put that in there? Linger with that. Ask, what's that doing there? And in the text that we use today from Genesis 12, it says repeatedly that the land that Abraham's going to get for his descendants is, that promised land is Israel. It's where the Canaanites are living. That's where the Canaanites, the people descended from Canaan, that's where they are, those Canaanites. Who cares? You're going to get the promised land. Cool, dude. So Abraham moves down there. The reason is that a guy named Canaan is a descendant of Ham. Remember, Ham was the guy who laughed at Dad when he was naked and drunk. So they're cursed. And so that's why it's going to be another 700 years before they even really begin to think about going into the promised land. And they're going to feel absolutely that this is their mandate, and they have the absolute right to do so because they're the chosen people of God. They're the people that God really likes. And those Canaanites are cursed, and they have absolutely no business being in the promised land. And so whatever it takes to eradicate them from that land, so be it. You have to understand that in the West, we have our Western mentality that comes out of kind of a different expression of where Jesus takes us. But the Middle East still really lives in the days of Abraham, Ishmael, and Isaac. And they hold on to, if you will, those grudges. They hold on to where it feels that someone has done something amiss. There are going to be all sorts of other threats that happen for Abraham to get him to where God wants him to be. But yet, when all is said and done, his name is going to show up in Hebrews 11, the so-called faith chapter in the New Testament. So that's 2,000 years later. And he gets there again, not because he did good, not even because he did his best ultimately to do what God wanted him to do. It was because he had the heart of God. And that heart of God kept steering him back on the circuitous serpentine route to ultimately get where God wanted him to go. And that's the deal for all of us. So, what are your tunnels? Where does it seem that there's only darkness? And that's okay. That's real. It doesn't mean God has forsaken you. In fact, it's probably just the opposite. That those are exactly the places where God is showing up. That's precisely the place where God is doing a unique and powerful miracle. Now, time and time again, with all these people that are listed in Hebrews 11, it says they didn't see the end of the story in their lifetimes. That's the nasty caveat of it all. That it takes faith, it takes hope, but when you look at it from the heart of God perspective, it isn't a maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't happen hope. It is a confident hope that it will happen, but it may not be in my lifetime. And that I have to be okay with that. Because God is doing what God does. God is doing love, and particularly in the darkest places. So what are those places for you? What is it that you can learn from Abraham? That with all of his shenanigans, he ultimately did what God wanted to do. He had that heart. How can you have that heart? What does that mean for you traversing in much the same way Abraham did? God is calling you somewhere. What does it mean for you to travel that path through the darkness? And to be confident that even though there may not be light at the end of the tunnel, there's light coming from above. That light will sustain you, and it will create the best possible future. Let's pray.